Good evening, everyone. A very warm welcome to you for tonight's discussion on longevity basis risk, Phase 2, assessing basis risk for longevity transactions. The Life and Longevity Markets Association, the LMMA, began publishing indices linked to population mortality statistics in March 2012, with the aim of facilitating the hedging of longevity risk for pension funds and annuity books. The launch of the LLMA indices was an important milestone towards a longevity market where risk management can be carried out through transactions that are linked to standardized population-level data. In addition to the mortality indices, the LLMA has also produced a significant body of work around possible derivative transactions that could reference mortality indices and offer standardized longevity risk management tools. However, these building blocks have not proved sufficient to develop a liquid market in longevity and have not led to transactions based on these standardized measures. We believe that a major obstacle to widespread use of longevity risk management tools that reference population-based mortality indices is the difficulty in quantifying and hence managing longevity basis risk. In December 2011, the LLMA and the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries formed the Longevity Basis Risk Working Group with a remit to investigate how to provide a market-friendly means of analysing longevity basis risk. Phase 1 of the project was completed by the Cass Business School and Hybans Robertson in December 2014, in which a decision tree framework was developed as a practical guide on how to select a two-population mortality model. It includes the M7 and M5 model and the CAE cohorts model and the characterization approach. Phase 2 of the project, which we're discussing here tonight, was commissioned by the IFOA and the LLMA in 2016 and was undertaken by Macquarie University with support from the University of Waterloo and Mercer, Australia. Phase 2 has focused on longevity basis risk in realistic scenarios under practical circumstances. Our two speakers tonight are Jackie Lee. Jackie Lee is an associate professor in actuarial science at Macquarie University. He obtained his first PhD in actuarial studies from the University of Melbourne and his second PhD in demography from Macquarie University. He is a fellow of the Institute of Actuaries of Australia. His research interests are in mortality and longevity modelling, pricing, stochastic reserving methods for general insurance. His research has been published in leading actuarial and demographic journals, including the Astin Bulletin, Insurance, Mathematics and Economics, the North American Actuarial Journal, the Scandinavian Actuarial Journal, the IFOA's Annals of Actuarial Science, Population Studies, and Demographic Research. From 2007 to 2014, Jackie worked in Nanyang Business School at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. He was one of the committee members for the accreditation agreement from the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries in 2012. Before he joined in academia, he worked as an actuary for a number of years in general insurance and superannuation. Jackie is accompanied here tonight by his colleague, Chong In Tan. Chong is a senior lecturer at Macquarie University and obtained his PhD from Nanyang Technology University. He is a fellow of the Society of Actuaries, a fellow of the Institute of Actuaries in Australia, and a chartered enterprise risk analyst. His major research interests are mortality, modelling, longevity risk, and bonus-malus systems. His research has been published in Insurance, Mathematics and Economics, and the IFOA's Annals of Actuarial Science. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming the speakers who will present the final report on assessing basis risk for longevity transactions. Over to you, Jackie.
Good evening. It's my great pleasure to be here giving a presentation. Today, I will talk about the major results of our project Assessing Basis Risk for Longevity Transactions, Phase 2. Before I start, on behalf of our research team, I would like to thank the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries and the Life and Longevity Markets Association for their very kind support on this project. Here are my research team members, myself, my colleague Professor Leonie Teko, and Macquarie University, Dr. Chong Tan, who is with us today, and Prof. Johnny Lee from University of Waterloo. Our focus is on index-based longevity hedging. Consider a pension plan with a certain amount of longevity risk. We call the population underlying the plan the book population. Suppose the pension plan sponsor wants to reduce the longevity risk exposure by using a hedging instrument. And this instrument is linked to a particular index population or reference population, such as English and Wales population of a specific cohort. This index-based approach, however, would not give a perfect hedge. Firstly, the book population and the reference population, though demographically related, are different after all, and they may have different mortality trends. Secondly, the number of lives in the pension plan is often much smaller than that in the whole population. The randomness of individual lives could drive the two experiences apart. Finally, the plan pays regularly on the survival of the pensioners, while the instrument pays according to its specific design. And the two streams of payments are usually different in their amounts and also timing. So, we have to find a way to measure the extent of mismatching between the two sides and then work out the actual amount of longevity risk that can be reduced. We call this mismatching longevity basis risk. From this discussion in the previous slide, we can broadly identify three sources of longevity basis risk, namely demographic basis risk caused by demographic or socio-economic differences, sampling basis risk due to random outcomes of individual lives, and structural basis risk because of the differences in payoff structures. Phase 1 of this project has provided a framework for modeling demographic basis risk. The current Phase 2 takes all the three risk components into account. Phase 2 has four main objectives. First, to determine the most relevant metrics for measuring longevity basis risk and hedge effectiveness. Second, to apply the framework developed in Phase 1 to realistic worked examples using appropriate data. And third, to present a robust quantification of basis risk to third parties like regulators. And fourth, to investigate the limitations of the time series processes. I want to emphasize that all these objectives are based on the methodology from Phase 1, and the main purpose of Phase 2 is to apply it, but not to develop new methods. Having said that, we still have explored a range of different extensions and also a number of other models for comparison purposes. Our data are provided by the CMI, the ONS, and Mercer Australia, and also the HMD. The first three data sets are taken as the book experience, and the last data set is taken as the reference experience. Here is a quick review of the methods in Phase 1. I know many of you have had a full day of hard work, and a lot of mathematical formulae is probably the last thing you want to see now. So I will go through it quickly. M7, M5 model. The first model component is for the reference population. Q represents the reference mortality rate at age X in year T. And as you can see in the graph, the whole mortality curve decreases over time, which reflect the ongoing mortality improvement of the reference population. On the right-hand side of the equation, kappa 1 refers to the level of the mortality curve, and obviously it decreases over time. Kappa 2 refers to the slope of the mortality curve, and you can see that it increases over time, which means the mortality curve gets steeper across time. Kappa 3 refers to the curvature of the mortality curve. Its increasing trend means that the mortality curve gets bent more over time. These three kappas are modeled by a trivariate random walk with drift. And we have the last parameter, gamma, which allows for the cohort effect, and it is modeled by an ARIMA 110 process. The second model component is for the book population. Q is the book mortality rate, and the difference between the logit book rate and the logit reference rate is expressed as another two kappas, kappa 1 and kappa 2. And these two kappas are modeled by an VAR1 process. The next one, CAE plus cohort model. In the first component, on the left, it is the logit Q again. On the right, it is a Lee-Carter kind of structure. Alpha X refers to the mortality schedule over age. Beta X is an age-specific sensitivity measure. And kappa T is the so-called mortality index, which indicates the overall mortality improvement over time. This kappa T is modeled by a random walk with drift. At the end, there is also the cohort parameter, which is modeled by an ARIMA 110. In the second model component, the difference between the logit book rate and the logit reference rate is expressed in terms of another Lee-Carter structure with a different alpha X, but the same beta X as above. That is why it is called common age effect, CAE, and a different kappa T, which is modeled by an AR1 process. The next option is called the characterization approach being proposed in phase 1. When the book data size is small, you can see it's very small, right? Modeling the book data directly may overestimate the basis risk. So, under this characterization approach, we don't do that. Instead, we further divide the book data into a few categories. For example, low income, high income, medium income, low income, and then we find some other data which have a large size for modeling. Now they look much bigger, isn't it? Then use them as a proxy for each category. Finally, the models are applied and fitted to these proxy data, and their simulations are aggregated together and are treated as if they were simulated from the original small book data. Besides the two models in phase 1, another model we would like to mention, we have also tested, is the one proposed by Zhou, Li, and Tan in 2013, modified with the cohort effect. In the first component, it has the same alpha X, beta X, kappa T, modeled by a random walk with drift, and gamma, modeled by an ARIMA 110 process. In the second component, the logit book rate itself, not the difference between the logit book rate and the logit reference rate. The logit book rate itself follows a Lee-Carter structure. Alpha X, the same beta X, and kappa T. Then, the difference between the two kappas are modeled by an AR1 process. And lastly, the gamma. Effectively, the CAE plus cohort model is a slight mutation of this Zhou, Li, and Tan model. Okay, the mathematical formula are over. Now we start with a simple hypothetical example of a pension plan. Suppose all pensioners are now age 65. Each pension pays £1 per year on survival from ages 66 to 90. The pension plan is closed and there are no new members. A 25-year index-based longevity swap is used to hedge the plan. The size of the swap is calculated from numerical optimization based on the simulated scenarios from the models. The objective of the optimization is to minimize the longevity risk of the pension liability. Assume that the interest rate is 1% per annum flat. Then, in the following sensitivity analysis, we also examine a variety of changes to these settings. For example, different plan sizes, multiple cohorts, including older ages, an open pension plan, several swaps for multiple cohorts, different interest rates, different data fitting periods, alternative simulation methods, additional features like mortality jumps and structural changes, and different time series processes. Here we will only go through the major ideas, and you can find all these details in the report. We focus on the use of index-based longevity swaps. In current practice, bespoke longevity swaps are by far the most commonly used swaps as hedging instruments, but now we focus on the use of index-based swaps. So how does an index-based swap work? Consider a pension fund which pays pensions to the pensioners, and these payments depend on the book experience. At the same time, if this fund enters into an index-based swap with a certain counterparty and make fixed regular payments, in return, the fund receives floating payments from the counterparty, and these payments depend on the reference experience. Clearly, the two sets of cash flows would not be perfectly matched due to demographic basis risk, sampling basis risk, and structural basis risk as mentioned earlier. It is important to, first, calibrate the swaps carefully in terms of the age buckets used, the maturities, and the weights. And second, to estimate the amount of longevity risk that can be reduced by using the swaps. Regarding the demographic basis risk, here are some simulated examples of how the book mortality rates and the reference mortality rates may move together or deviate from each other over time. We use the CMI data, the HMD data, the CAE plus cohort model, and a single cohort age 65 in 2014 for this demonstration. In the first graph, the black lines are for the book population, and the gray lines are for the reference population. The book mortality is lower than the reference mortality. And of course, the mortality rates increase with age for a specific cohort. Moreover, the solid lines refer to the best estimates, and the dotted lines refer to the simulated values. You can see in this simulated scenario, the two populations' future mortality rates follow their expected values closely and move in parallel amongst each other. Everything seems to go according to the plan, and there's not much drama here. In the second scenario, both populations' future mortality rates deviate from their expected values over time. But since they still go hand in hand with each other, there's still not much mismatching problem. But in the third scenario, while the reference mortality rates stick closely to the expected values, the book mortality rates diverge from the expected trend and deviate significantly from the reference mortality rates in the later period, being much lower than what it is supposed to be. This is the mismatching we would worry about. There are certainly many other scenarios that could be simulated, but they would fall broadly into these three categories. Now the question is, what is the probability for each scenario to occur? And the last one here is the basis risk we've been talking about. We need one of those two population mortality projection models mentioned earlier to measure this basis risk. Using an appropriate model which allows for longevity basis risk, we can measure the effectiveness of an index-based longevity hedge. Here, we show the simulated distributions of the pension liability using some CMI, ONS, and Mercer Australia data sets before and after taking the hedge. it is very clear that the hedge significantly reduces the simulated variability of the pension liability. In particular, the right tail is very much reduced. And this tail may be of much concern in practice and may indicate certain opportunities for capital savings. To quantify the precise level of longevity risk reduction, we define it with this formula. The notation risk unhedged is the portfolio's longevity risk before taking the hedge. Risk hedged is the risk afterwards. In effect, this metric gives the percentage of the portfolio's initial longevity risk that is being hedged away. Regarding the risk measures, we consider the common ones, including the variance, standard deviation, the value at risk, and expected shortfall. Although the variance is the one usually adopted in the basis risk literature, this risk measure has a different scale to the other three, and it always results in a much higher calculated level of risk reduction than the others. So we focus on the other three risk measures, but not quite the variance. In addition, the value at risk is highly relevant, as you all know, to the solvency capital requirement under Solvency II, and the expected shortfall has recently been suggested to replace the value at risk in some banking regulations. So we focus on the standard deviation, the value at risk, and expected shortfall. After examining several hundreds of simulated cases from different model settings, different data sets, and hedging environments, in which each case we simulated 5,000 scenarios, we find that for a large pension plan or large annuity portfolio, like having around 20,000 lives or more, the risk reduction level is often around 50% to 80%. But for a small plan or a small portfolio, the risk reduction is usually less than 50%. These results highlight the impact of sampling basis risk, under which the high variability in a small book due to individual uncertainty can significantly hamper the effectiveness of an index-based hedge. But note that the precise risk reduction level really depends on the particular circumstances being studied, and more details can be found in the report. As mentioned above, we have done an extensive sensitivity analysis, and this is the list of the most important factors we have found in calculating the risk reduction. The first is whether the portfolio size is large, as what I have covered just now. Whether the model is coherent, it means that the projected ratio or the expected ratio of the future mortality rates between the two populations at each age converges to a constant in the long term. Whether the book data is a significant subset of the reference data, is the longevity swap or other derivatives like the Q forward being used, whether bootstrapping or a simple parametric method is used, and whether structural mortality changes are incorporated into the modeling process. Studying the limitations and the implications of the time series modeling is one of the main objectives in phase 2. As our book data cover only a very short period of time, many of the sophisticated time series processes cannot be used in our work. But we still test different variations of the time series modeling assumptions and study the corresponding impact. We find that the most important factor is whether the assumed future variability of the book minus reference component is bounded or not. In fact, despite the obvious differences in the mortality structures between the models, we find the simulated variability of this model component, whether it's bounded or not, turns out to be the most important modeling consideration in estimating the risk reduction. Another important factor is how fast the model could reach coherence. That is, how fast the two populations' future mortality rates would move back in line expectedly. Comparatively, the other correlation assumptions are not so important. Further research is required when more book data of longer periods and for different portfolios can be collected in the future. Finally, we summarize the hedging results of our hundreds of simulated cases in a simple qualitative way and also another simple quantitative way. Two important general insurance reports, industry reports in Australia, have used these approaches in the past. Regulators and practitioners may expand these two ideas to develop, say, a prescribed approach of calculating the risk reduction of an index-based longevity hedge compared to a full internal modeling approach which requires the use of the phase 1 models and other models. Here is an example, a very much simplified scenario. Imagine you are a pension actuary talking to yourself in a lonely night in your room after a whole day of hard work and a lot of meetings. You think about your plan, the plan you manage, and you start to ask yourself, does the plan have a lot of members? If yes, you get 50 points. Remember, for a large portfolio, the risk reduction is often 50% or more based on our simulations. The next question, are the two populations very related? Quite, 6 out of 10, I think. Do the two populations' future mortality rates move back in line quickly? Average, I would say 5 points out of 10. Would there be potential structural changes that affect both populations in about the same way? Maybe. Let's give 4. When you add the scores together, it's a total of 65, which means about 65% of the risk can potentially be hedged away. Here is a simple linear regression formula summarizing all our simulated results. There are 10 explanatory variables, including the log portfolio size, how related the two populations are, the design of the hedging scheme, the interest rate, using swaps or Q forwards, whether M7, M5 is used, whether CAE plus cohorts is used, which simulation method is adopted, whether structural mortality changes are incorporated, and the autoregressive order of the book minus reference components time series process. The first 5 variables refer to the pension plan and the hedging environment, and the other 5 describe the model settings and assumptions. The signs of the coefficients can tell us how the risk reduction estimate would react to a change in a certain factor. The larger the size, the higher the risk reduction, and so the positive sign. The closer the relationship between the two populations, the higher the risk reduction. By the way, we use a categorical variable here to differentiate the relationships. The more approximate the hedging scheme, the lower the risk reduction. Again, we use a categorical variable here. The higher the interest rate, the lower the risk reduction. Using Q forwards decreases the risk reduction. These two values indicate that the CAE plus cohorts model tends to give a higher risk reduction estimate. Using a simple parametric method, which does not allow for parameter uncertainty, increases the risk reduction. This highlights the importance of incorporating parameter uncertainty in the simulations. Including structural changes increase the risk reduction because the two populations would move more consistently if they are both influenced significantly by the same factor. And lastly, the higher the autoregressive order, the slower the convergence of the time series process in the book minus reference component, the more the mismatching, the lower the risk reduction. We hope that this project work, both phase 1 and phase 2, will encourage a step change in the ability to assess longevity basis risk. Looking forward, it is important to further test more book data, more mortality models and time series processes, and more hedging scenarios to gain a deeper understanding of longevity basis risk and to identify opportunities for potential capital savings. It is also important to communicate the results properly with different stakeholders, the insurers, banks, regulators, clients, on the feasibility and the practical implementation of index-based hedging. Finally, it would be worthwhile for regulators and the industry to develop a standardized and comprehensive list of key factors that drive longevity basis risk. And then practitioners can choose between a prescribed approach, which makes a simple use of these standardized factors, or alternatively, an internal modeling approach, which requires necessary expertise to perform the modeling and the computations. If you're interested in the latter and requires such modeling surface, give us Macquarie University a call. A lot of the details can be found in the final report. The report can be approached in 3 different ways. If you don't have much time, you can simply go through the graphs and the tables. There are many of them, and you can get some very rough idea from these graphs and tables. And those who want to get more information, you can read the relevant chapters in more detail. And particularly for those who have difficulty in going to sleep at night, it's a 140-page report. Reading through that may help. Finally, for those modelers, analysts, and academics who have unexplainable obsession with mathematical formulae and programming, like myself, you are encouraged to read the 2 appendices. All the technical details of our work are given there. Thank you for listening to my presentation. I hope you've enjoyed it and find it informative in some way. Thank you very much. I would now like to invite my colleague, Dr. Chong Tan, to join me for the Q&A session.
Thank you, Jackie. The discussion is now open to the floor. I'm looking forward to an interesting and stimulating debate. I can see a number of well-known practitioners of longevity and longevity modelling in the audience. So I'd like to encourage as many members who wish to contribute. May I invite anyone that thinks he or she may wish to contribution to let me know of their intention by raising their hands. There is a reminder that we are being recorded for the British Actuarial Journal, so please clearly state your name before making your contribution, and please also wait for the roving microphone to reach you before you make your contribution. And with that, I'd like to open the discussion to the floor. Is there anyone who would like to start? Please.
Well, first of all, I would like to thank the 2 presenters that are here tonight, but the whole of the team for the quite lengthy but also very stimulating document that I've enjoyed reading over the last few days. Now, partly I'm standing up here because I'm the director of the Actuarial Research Centre, and although this particular project was commissioned before the Actuarial Research Centre was formed in its expanded scope, it's overseeing the commissioned research projects as part of the actuarial profession, and so it's very nice to see one of these projects come to fruition and to be presented here tonight at a sessional research meeting, which is our flagship events for presentation of results and also discussion and feedbacks. But I also wear another hat because I'm heading up you might think of it as being a successor research project on longevity risk. It also has a wider scope, but as part of that project funded through the ARC, we're looking at risk management, and the index-based hedging is part of what we're looking at. And so a lot of the content of this paper, but also the discussion that we might get tonight, will be potentially influential in terms of the particular directions that we take within our own research. So just thinking about, and what I'll make is probably a lot of comments with the occasional questions, but just by way of introduction, so we've seen the focus here on the index-based hedges, And I see these as being, that although there hasn't been very much activity on the index-based hedging so far, as was discussed, that I do see this as being becoming increasingly relevant and prevalent in the coming years. Because otherwise, if it doesn't happen in that sort of way, it's going to be rather difficult to satisfy the demand that is coming from the hedgers, be it the pension funds or insurance companies. And part of that supply has to come from the capital markets. So this might not be achieved necessarily in individual steps. So the role of index-based hedges might not be so much for pension plans to transfer to insurers or reinsurers, but it might be part of a chain. So what we might see is that there are customized swaps between pension plans and insurers, and that comes out of the sampling risk that has been an important part of tonight's paper, where we see that the smaller pension plans, which is probably most pension plans in terms of the numbers that are being talked about, that for them the sampling risk is perhaps too big to be thinking about an index-based hedge. But they might have a customized swap with a reinsurer, but then the reinsurer, in order to release capacity on their part, because eventually they will become saturated, they can release capacity by themselves issuing some sort of index-based hedge into the market. And so this is a way where I see that tonight's work might be particularly useful. Moving on now to just talk about the paper, and I'll try and make some comments that are really related to all of the different sections, but the first part that I'm probably speak least about is the data part of the paper, where it's certainly very useful in terms of having the different data sets for road testing the different bits of the technology and seeing what the differences are. Then the second part is introducing the two population models. Thirdly, and this is maybe, I found it slightly hidden in the paper, is the bit of the paper which is actually introducing the risk measures and hedge effectiveness. Fourthly, there's the hedging instruments, and then fifth is the very extensive part. It's really the meat of the paper, where the authors are analysing doing a lot of numerical tests on the different models and lots of variations. Now, so on the data side, there's not much to say except that in terms of what's in the paper or what's not in the paper, that what's missing perhaps would be just a little bit of a summary of each of the data sets in terms of numbers of exposures, because that then feeds into the later parts of the paper in terms of trying to interpret some of the numbers that are coming out. There's also a question about whether the data might or might not be made available, because it's certainly quite useful for us researchers and people in industry to be able to try out their own models and with various data sets to see whether they're going to work. And then another question is when it comes to the model calibrations, and this might be in the paper, but I maybe didn't have time to see that, but did the model calibrate, when they did the model calibrations and fitting the time series models, etc., did the authors find to any extent a sort of what I would call volatility bias creeping in? So did the smaller populations that you looked at, did you see the increased volatilities, which was highlighted in the phase 1 paper? Moving on to the bit on risk measures, so that was well introduced in the presentation with the 4 measures that then was reduced to 3. What wasn't completely clear in the paper was when you were looking at value at risk in particular, was it value at risk based on the runoff distribution, or was it 1 year ahead value at risk, which is embedded in Solvency II? Obviously, insurers will be, particularly in the UK, they'll be more focused on the 1 year value at risk, but then there are related issues in terms of having to recalibrate the model after 1 year, as well as, and so there are differences in terms of which value at risk it is that you're measuring, and certainly hedge effectiveness calculations on that 1 year would be welcome, but it might be that what's in the paper is 1 year, but I think it's the runoff. Then moving on to hedging instruments, the authors have considered a range of what I would consider to be sort of plain vanilla types of contracts, so swaps and so on. But it might be useful in follow-up work, be it through your project or depending on how people and the audience think that it may be things that my own research group takes on. It's looking at some alternative contracts which are contracts that other people are looking at. But in the current paper, there's a longevity swap which forms the sort of initial core part of the analysis, and but the floating leg payments are based on the national population without any adjustment, and something that could be easily incorporated into that particular example is to include experience ratios which would adjust the national population mortality rates year on year to level them up or down so that they're seen from the outset as being having the same expected values rather than one of them being 50% throughout. Because then in the numerical examples you see, particularly when you look at the index of multiple deprivation groups, you see that, as you discuss in the paper, that the group 3 in the middle does best, and that's really because I think that the mortality rates for group 3 are very similar in terms of their level to the national population, or at least the expected levels, whereas the high deprivation people, that they die off very quickly compared to the national population, and the low deprivation groups die off much less slowly. So you get this sort of mismatch later on, and a lot of that could be addressed through introducing experience ratios, and therefore you may well get comparable levels of hedge effectiveness by incorporating those factors. And these are factors which people in the industry are already using with these sorts of contracts. And then also you could, this would be for further work, that we should also be thinking about introducing optionality into some of these contracts. For example, in the Aegon deal in the Netherlands, that was based on national mortality, but it included a cap and a floor on the payments, and that helps to move on to the capital markets, because what they want are both not just time limited, but also limited liability in terms of the payments. The paper's got a very good account of the three types of basis risk. So again, in these slides we had population basis risk, sampling basis risk, and then the structural basis risk. And the impact of sampling risk is well covered in the paper and in the presentation in terms of the different scheme sizes. So there are lots of examples where you can see what is the impact of having 10,000 or 1,000 members, say. But when it moves then goes on to looking at population basis risk and structural basis risk, the reader has to work just a little bit harder to separate those two things out. And perhaps one way ahead in terms of getting a better grip on the impact of population basis risk versus structural is to rerun the simulations, but to include perfect correlation rather than less than perfect correlation. And that way you would really filter out the population basis risk, and what would be left would be the structural basis risk. So that's something that is perhaps worth trying. And part of the reason for that is it's important for regulators to be able to know something about the population basis risk in particular and its impact. On the optimization side in the paper, which is sort of touched on a little bit here and there, in the paper I think what the authors are typically doing is optimizing in the sense of maximizing the hedge effectiveness. But in many circumstances it might be more complex than that. So for example, and in particular, there's going to be a trade-off. So there's going to be, you would be wanting to think about the risk appetite of the hedger, and then you also have to think about what is the price of the hedge that's going to be put in place. So if it's more expensive, then you might still want to hedge, but not at the same level as if it was a lower price. So there's an interesting bit of work still to be done in that direction to really take what's in this paper, take it through to a question of perhaps something like what is the economic value added or destroyed as a result of putting a hedge into place. And that all comes down to questions of risk appetite and economic capital calculations, as well as regulatory capital calculations. Sections 4 and 5, these contain very helpful and very extensive numerical results. The results confirm a lot of intuition. So, as I said before, the middle group for the index of multiple deprivation, that does better than the other groups because of this. Their trajectory is similar in some sense to the national population rather than dying off faster or slower. So that's one of the intuitive results that you see, that for the more extreme groups that you get less or lower hedge effectiveness. Also intuitive are the results on scheme size and interest rates. But what is new and very useful in the paper is, well, we know what direction these things are going in, but what is the magnitude of these impacts? And then there's also the magnitude of the variations between the different non-IMD groups, the Australian pensioners and also the CMI data sets. But there could be still a little bit more interpretation of the differences. So are the differences for these different groups, is it due to the sort of duration or the average age or average expected lifetimes, or is it due to the volatility of the book population relative to the reference, or perhaps it's due to differences in the intrinsic correlations? It's going to be a combination of these factors, but it's certainly, when you're analysing a particular data set, you want to be thinking, well, why is this population different from the middle IMD group? And then lastly, you'll be glad to hear I'm just finishing off now, so it's the model risk is also an important part of the paper, an important contribution that comes out of it. And this is a section that should be of interest to regulators. So in the UK, we have the Prudential Regulatory Authority, and they have specific guidelines for when you're doing single population modelling. And it's guidelines which talk about the combined use of several single population stochastic models. And over time, it may be that the regulators might wish to extend the single population guidelines to 2 populations or even more populations. So lots of comments, the occasional question, but again, I want to thank the authors.
Andrew, thank you for your very extensive input. While it's fresh in the mind, can I ask Jackie and Sean to respond to any of those? Are there any of those points you care to respond to?
Thank you, Professor, for your very valuable comments. One thing I want to respond is actually the last point, the model risk. We realize that certainly using different models really can come up with quite different numbers sometimes. So I think I have a point to add to that is, apart from simply comparing different models generate different results and compare the results, I think one useful one, at least academically, is to use Bayesian to try to look at to try to allow for the model risk. But of course, using Bayesian method would be a lot more time-consuming and demanding, computational demanding. And regarding the point about the cost of the hedge, we agree that it is certainly a next step to do. Because right now in the report, we just assume that we assume the forward swap rate is just the expected value of the future rate, and implying a 0 risk premium, which is just a convenient assumption. When there are more data, we hope to further work on this area and try to price how much is this swap, and then whether it's worth taking the swap to hedge the plan. And another point that we find is very helpful is you suggested that we can assume a perfect relationship between the 2 populations and then filter out the demographic basis risk, and then so you can then focus on the structural basis risk. I think it's a very good suggestion, and we certainly want to try that when we go back home. And lastly, I think one interesting thing I also realized is that you mentioned about the example of the index swap by Deutsche Bank in 2012. That's a 12 billion euro index-based swap that is targeted to the capital market investors. They set it to only 20 years, if I'm not wrong, and this is the market perception of how long, the longest they can take the risk. And they have caps and floors. So it would be very interesting research to further consider these caps and floors, these options features into the derivatives and price and see the hedge effectiveness. That would be a very interesting research for the future. But overall, yeah, that's all my comments, and thank you.
Thank you, Professor Andrew, for the valuable comments. I just want to respond on a couple of things regarding the model calibration. So because of the limited size of the data, book data, when we try to fit the data set, there are a lot of sampling variability. And when we move on to the time series process parameter estimates, we figure that with a small book size and a short history, is a disaster. So the volatility is a really key concern. I think if we want to do this in a very meaningful way, we need a bigger size, we need a longer history, which is, in the phase 1 decision tree framework, suggested the importance of that. So our finding confirmed that, double confirmed that. Regarding the value at risk, it's not the 1 year value at risk, it's the run-off value at risk. So it will be interesting to extend the analysis and look at the 1 year value at risk and see whether the results might be robust or it may change. For the comment on the experience ratio and the optionality of the hedging instrument, I think that's a very interesting suggestion for future research, and look at how might the structural different payoff structure of the hedging instrument might impact or might increase or reduce the basis risk reduction. Regarding the comment about the perfect correlation about dissecting the population basis risk and the structural basis risk, because in the three risk, they are sampling risk is can be standalone, and sampling risk can be perceived as one in the number of lives when we talk about the pension plan. Another way to look at the sampling risk is on the data set. So that would be the fitting sampling risk. So regarding the population risk and structural risk, I think if we go back to a single population with the same reference population and the book population, so in that case, there's no demographic basis risk, we can indeed quantify the structural risk. So in some way, pension plan, we are paying the survival probability, and if we're using Q forward, of course, there will be a mismatch. But if we do extend to a different reference and book, then the structural risk would just flow. It is a certain feature. So in that sense, the perfect correlation example is a very interesting suggestion. So we would definitely look at that. But I think the population and structural, they are kind of related. Regarding the optimization objective, so in our paper, we just look at the risk reduction, and it is certainly very informative to look at what if we bring in the risk appetite and the the price, because I remember in the phase 1 Sessional meeting, we watched the video. So one of the questions would be the cost and benefit analysis. So when we say cost, that the price will certainly be a factor. And yeah, that's my response to Professor Andrews' comments.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Can I ask for the next question from the floor? Please, anyone else?
Stephen Baxter, Hyams Robertson. Firstly, my congratulations to the authors on a fantastic paper that's added a lot to our knowledge of the sensitivities and the key considerations when it comes to the hedging of longevity basis risks. So thank you. If I may, just a few observations and comments. I was struck by, I think there's a number of key sensitivity or key additions that could be added to the sensitivities. If I understand the paper correctly, throughout your theoretical portfolios you're looking at effectively pay £1 per person of annuity. And in reality, obviously, the portfolios we deal with have a considerable spread of annuity payments across individuals. And I think in reality, that just simply reduces the effective size of the book in terms of the sampling risks you described, and therefore further probably reduces the hedge effectiveness. And I also suspect that once we bring in some of the practical aspects of the instruments available in the market, the limited duration, effectively a settlement payment at the end of the duration that's based upon a formulaic expectation of the evolution of longevity beyond the term of the contract, that would further potentially reduce the effectiveness of the contract. So that therefore strikes me, there's a couple of things that on the sensitivities might be reducing the benefit of hedges. Is there things that we can do that we should also take into consideration that might work the other way? And two things struck me. Excuse me. The first is I suspect the analysis is a buy and hold strategy. You buy an instrument at the outset and you follow things through runoff, as Andrew was describing. And if that's the case, the reality is you could always go out and restructure your hedge over time, and that may mean that over time you get to better, effectively, hedge effectiveness, although obviously there's some frictional costs to be analysed there. The other thing that struck me as a possible way of enhancing the hedge effectiveness is to actually have a small number of subpopulation indices. So for instance, if you chose deprivation quintiles and then modelled things at the decile level, would that actually effectively massively improve the hedge effectiveness, or would it be marginal, the benefit? And I'd be interested in the author's thoughts on that. I think the final thing I'll just perhaps sort of throw open as an open remark and question is the fact that inevitably the likely early adopters of such instruments, for instance, insurance companies and reinsurance companies, to free up balance sheet capacity, have quite sophisticated balance sheets and metrics that are obviously considerably more complex than the natural ones you chose tonight, the things like the one-year Solvency II metrics, the interaction more broadly across the corporate balance sheet. And I just wondered if the authors had given that any thought or had any plans at looking at the more holistic picture and understanding some of the dynamics of particular practical interest to insurers and regulators. But once again, thank you.
So could you, if anyone else would like to ask a question later, could you just give me an indication of the number of people who would like to ask questions? If you could just raise your hand if you're tempted to ask a question at some point. In which case, can we go to Guy, to your question now then, please? After this one.
Again, I'd like to congratulate the authors on a fine paper and very well and clearly presented tonight. For me, when I think of basis risk, the important thing is hedge effectiveness. And hedge effectiveness you can view in two ways, which I think are different conceptually, practically, and economically. And that's hedge effectiveness in the body of the distribution versus hedge effectiveness in the tail. So what you might have referred to as your volatility versus VAR metric. Clearly, the hedge effectiveness in the body of the distribution is more susceptible to noise, which may come from sampling error, it may come from modeling error, it just may come from the intrinsic variability in the mortality processes underlying the two populations. But when you get into the tails, and if you get into the extreme tails, that becomes less important. It's also the most economically relevant area. The difficulty, I think, with any kind of modelling of hedge effectiveness in those extreme areas is coming up with a realistic simulation model appropriately correlated of extreme scenario movements. So when the mortality outcomes are far from the expected path. Do you have any insights into how we can sort of make some progress on this kind of simulation model to capture more realistic extreme scenarios? And that's what, clearly that's what hedges are most concerned about. I think the conceptual linkage there is that, particularly if one population is a subpopulation of the other, that the bigger the movement, the greater you would expect the pull or the coherence that you referred to get you a higher hedge effectiveness going forward.
Okay, can I ask Jackie and John to respond to the last two questions?
I would like to address the question by, I think, Stephen regarding the use of different subsets. In this paper, for the single cohort hedging, we make use of the longevity swap, which is a very simple assumption. We kind of like keep track of the cohort over time. There's no need to change the position once you establish the position at the start. But a good alternative would be like using Q forwards, which track the variability, the basis risk over different time period. So when we are talking about single cohort, we may use, say, 4 to 5 Q forwards catering for different age. And this is especially important when we move to multiple cohort. I think in the presentation just now, Jackie did not go through the multiple cohort plan in detail, but it can be found in the paper, which is that we use the longevity swap to cater to different cohorts. Because once you have a range of cohorts, obviously a limited number of longevity swaps are not going to be sufficient. Regarding to the point about the hedging strategy at the outset, again, this goes back to the point of choosing longevity swaps. In that sense, because of our choice, there's no need to adjust the position over time. Of course, if we still want to adjust the position, that can be done. And in that case, probably I'm thinking the longevity swap might be, okay, I'm going to initiate a longevity position for the next 10 years. 10 years later, I'm going to change the position. In that sense, we are doing a dynamic hedging. So that could be, in theory, the hedge effectiveness would be better, but how much better, that we are not sure. Regarding the point by Guy regarding the tail, that's a very difficult question to be. Okay, when I say difficult, I mean we find that in the existing literature, when we try to focus on the variance, actually, because of using longevity swap, we can have an analytical optimal hedge ratio, because the longevity swap is going to track the survivability of the single cohort over time. So if you're using Q forward or S forward, that doesn't allow us to do so. So with longevity swap, when it comes to optimizing the variance or the standard deviation risk reduction, that can be done easily. But when it comes to tail measure, it is difficult, and one difficulty that, at least in theory, is that because when we calculate the tail measure, essentially we are ranking the 99.5, the most extreme 0.5%, be it the value at risk or the expected shortfall, we are re-ranking before the hedge and after the hedge. So because of our choice of the optimal weight, say this scenario was ranked number 45 before the hedge, it would be ranked 176 after the hedge. So that is a kind of, because of the need to re-ranking, at the moment, as far as we are aware, there's no common mathematical measure or property to take care of that. So probably, as we are doing the project, we're thinking about like talking to mathematicians. Who knows, there might be some measure in that area. So if we can tackle the problem of re-ranking using some mathematical measure that we are not aware of, who knows, it may exist out there, then the tail risk hedging problem, we can definitely do some more meaningful analysis. At the moment, it is, when I say difficult, I mean we are not sure what is a good indication. So let me go back to the longevity swap with regards to variance reduction. In that sense, what we need to do is to simulate 10,000, 5,000, 1,000, whatever, and we can, based on the variance and the covariance and stuff, because the optimal hedge ratio is going to be a function of variance and covariance, and that's it. There's no need to go through to the numerical optimization. But in this project, we are looking at the 99.5% value at risk. That's why, at the moment, our numerical optimization is the best alternative. But that is a problem that I think academics can start looking at that, and we may find a better way out, because if we can solve that even at the tail part, then I think that would be good for the industry practitioners.
Yeah, I have just quick comments on the extreme scenarios. And extreme scenarios are extreme, so it's difficult to find data to allow for it. But in the report, we actually have tried something on allowing for those things. We, if I'm not wrong, in the solvency capital requirement, Solvency II, one way to allow for the so-called longevity shock is to decrease all mortality rates by 10%. So we actually tried like a bit subjectively, artificially, it's just decrease the book and the reference by 10%, 20%, 30%, but by different amounts, a bit of basis risk, and see the effects. And it turns out that the simulation numbers are not bad. The hedging results are indicating that still at least a third of the loss could be avoided by having a hedge and an index-based hedge, even if we allow for those extreme movements in the mortality rates subjectively. And we also tried a few, we mentioned just now mortality jumps, structural changes. Those are like more extreme changes. And after we allow for that, of course, the variability, overall variability increases a lot, and the tail behavior would be different. And the simulated results turn out to be quite well as well. So, so the more details can be found in the report, but right now the way we set it up is more subjective, because we don't have the data for the tail. We have a few world wars, we have a few epidemics. It means that we don't have a lot of data on that. So we have to so far we have tried a few subjective allowance for that, and it turns out that the simulated results, the hedging results are still quite in line with the others. So, but that would be an interesting area, and I think, personally, different models and different scenario testing can be done for the tail scenarios. That's my response to the.
Okay, thank you. I think we have time for a couple more questions. So there's one at the back there, please.
Stephen Rimmer. On your slide where you had the...
Sorry, I don't think your mic's on. If you can just hang a second. Could we have that mic turned on? Could you try again now, please?
Hello, Stephen Rimmer. On the slide where you had hedge effectiveness in terms of a series of factors, it seemed like some of the factors were decisions about the modelling that have been done to understand the contract. So could you explain a bit more how that sort of feeds through into an increased or decreased hedge effectiveness? So the picture I've got in my mind is we've got two reinsurers who say have a 50% quota share on the same portfolio. They've bought the same contract. Is there some sense to which the way they're doing their internal modelling and perceiving the contract affects hedge effectiveness?
Sorry, can you please repeat the question?
So I don't know if we can go back one slide. Oh no, sorry, two. The one with the factors on. Yeah, so we've got the risk reduction. A factor in how much risk reduction you get seems to be a choice about modelling. I was wondering if we can understand a bit more. Am I misunderstanding what we mean by risk reduction? Or is there some extent to which the way you perceive the risk is what we're measuring?
Correct me if I'm wrong. So you are saying effectively it seems to suggest that the risk reduction that we are getting is a matter of the assumption settings and the hedging instrument environment and so on. This is the results based on the hundreds of simulations that we have done. It does not suggest that, it does not directly suggest that using certain assumption might lead to a better risk reduction or worse, vice versa, but rather it is a manifestation of different sensitive or insensitive assumptions might give rise to different hedging results. Like, for example, if the book size is rather small, then according to our numerical results, is that the risk reduction would be most of the time below 50%. So I would say the first 5, because we categorize the first 5 as something that we couldn't control to a certain extent, and the last 5 is something that we could control, like, for example, using a different model or using a different simulation method. So with regards to the first 5, we have less control, and rather we are taking what is given and we can estimate the risk reduction. I do definitely agree that we have an option to play around with different methods and different variables when it comes to the last 5 measures, but that's, I think personally, this project, the way I look at it is that apart from the data size, the demographic structure, the rest of it are based on assumptions. So the time series process is definitely one big part. So using different time series process might lead to good or poor results. And what we find is that the simulated future variability of the book and reference population is the most critical one. So in that sense, if we are using time series process that support or that imply a bounded variability, then we are going to get a good risk reduction. That's a model artifact. But again, when it comes to choosing an appropriate time series process, of course, we have to exercise our own judgment whether the coherent or whether the bounded or the unbounded variability might be the case in the future. Yeah.
Thank you.
I think we've probably got time for one more question from the floor. So is there anyone who hasn't said anything who would like to say anything? Or would any of the previous question askers like to come back on any of the points that were responded to their questions? In which case, I'll use the chairman's privilege and ask my own question, which is, if this research were to go to phase 3, what do you think would be the most productive areas to investigate? And what do you think the challenges of such a investigation would be?
I think I'll start first. I think based on the things I've seen in phase 1 and based on the things I've done in phase 2, I think we've already stretched most of the things we could do based on the data we have. So I think if there's going to be a phase 3, I think we need to collect more data to do the work. Especially the book data really limits the things we could have done. I think we are stretching to the limit of what could be done under the models and with the data we've got. Apart from that, apart from getting more data and trying more models, the next thing is to I just talked to one of you, and the next thing is to communicate results to see whether more practical elements can be put into the research, and how this can be communicated with the regulators, and how this can be translated into reality. I mean, if having the regulators, for example, allowing for capital savings using index-based hedging, how it could more convincing results could be produced. So I think that would be if there's going to be a phase 3.
For me, I think the phase 3 would be, going back to the question, would a pension plan given a choice about a bespoke de-risking solution and an index-based longevity swap or mortality derivatives, we need to look at the cost and the benefit on a very, very practical side. So, for example, would the regulator be convinced to they only need to set aside less capital for that purpose if they use an index-based solution? Or so in that case, it is about further convincing the pension plans, the regulators, all the stakeholders on the demand side to come together and let's have a reality check about what can be done and what is further needed. And on the supply side, I think communication and the need of what are the advantages of investing in a longevity asset classes to many other players that are not related to mortality or longevity exposure. That might be one thing to do on the supply side. But I think the challenge is on the demand side, on a very, very practical perspective. Yeah.
Okay, I think time is now caught up with us. I'd like to thank our speakers. I'd like to thank you all very much for some interesting comments. Andrew, in particular, I thought your comments about the role of index-based transactions as part of a chain of transactions of risk transfer, but I hadn't actually heard it phrased that way before, and I think conceptually that does seem to make sense to me, to have the bespoke transactions to meet the needs of the trustees' pension schemes, but then when you're dealing with professional reinsurers, probably to the capital markets, the index-based solutions do seem a natural way, and as everyone keeps saying, we do keep expecting this market to develop beyond the depends how you count it, but the 10, 15 billion a year that it seems to have been sort of running along at. Stephen, thank you for your comments on a number of ways of improving hedge effectiveness. And Guy, also for your comments on the issues of the extreme tail. And I'm very sympathetic with this response that if you only have a limited amount of data, even a huge amount of data, how do you simulate the event beyond the data? So I think there remains quite a lot of areas that can be investigated. The need for more data is, I think, it remains an open one. There are obviously very large pension, particularly state pension schemes in countries outside the UK, elsewhere in Europe, elsewhere in Asia. So I think there are a number of data sets that have scale, but maybe not the history. So I think the European data sets maybe have a longer history, but tend to be smaller in scale than potentially some of those elsewhere. So I think that certainly is an area for investigation going forward. So I'd now like to express my own thanks, and for all of us, for the presenters of the paper and for yourselves. So if we could please thank the presenters in the traditional way.